probably going to rebuy the game on Steam, I mean Voduke. If there's one character who's been through a lot of ups and downs in every patch of the game, it's the Zapper.
Hold, Shadow, stop!
He went from having broken, unusable abilities to having broken, overpowered abilities. It's actually possible that the Zapper is a top tier character right now, but the only way to back up a claim this bold is to examine all of his stats and abilities, starting with the Zapper at level 1. To begin, he has 4 HP, 0 armor, 3 attack, 2 speed, and 4 range. He's frail enough that I wouldn't recommend letting him tank at all, but he does have a trait that makes it useful to put him in melee range of enemies. That would be his passive trait, Shocking Presence. This ability makes enemies take true damage at the start of the Zapper's turn if they are adjacent to him. The damage is equal to his level, so it deals 1 damage at first, but at max level it deals 3. A few things won't be affected by this passive: scenery like fire pots, hazards like snap vines, and the following enemies: tentacles, explosive blobs, and bosses. So it's just regular enemies who are affected. Because the damage triggers at the start of the Zapper's turn, it often gives enemies a chance to attack him first. However, there are a few workarounds to this. The first happens naturally, when skeletons respawn next to him. The second is to be adjacent to a stunned enemy, so that they can't attack him back. The third workaround is to grant him some kind of protection. Gerald makes for a great synergy in this regard, because Shield of Retribution will allow him to absorb any attack without suffering damage. Gerald himself is also useful because he's a hero. NPCs and heroes take priority when enemies are equally close to multiple of the player's units. Having the Zapper and a character with higher priority both standing adjacent to an enemy will make the enemy target the other character, allowing the Zapper to get some extra damage in with Shocking Presence. Just beware of enemies that deal splash damage. Finally, giving the Zapper armor allows him to tank the attacks he may receive from some enemies. Don't forget that Shocking Presence isn't an alternative to his skills. You should never sacrifice the chance to use one of his attacks in order to use Shocking Presence. As a passive, it triggers on its own without affecting skills. So to maximize his damage output, you should always have a way to use his skills while also finding a way to use Shocking Presence. That is, as long as the extra damage actually matters. Don't put the Zapper in danger when the damage doesn't change whether or not an enemy dies. If the enemy is at low HP, or will be brought to low HP by an attack later in the round, then Shocking Presence may be able to help finish them off or put them at fatally low HP. The skill has to add up to something useful. However, there is one problem to all of this. Shocking Presence is doo-doo. Actually, it would be better if the skill was doo-doo, because that would at least poison the enemies. Right now, this is just a loud, embarrassing, trumpet-like fart. I mean it. 1 damage, even if it's true damage, is just not worth putting the Zapper in melee range of enemies. All of the tips I gave to allow him to safely engage with enemies are universal ways to help a character avoid taking damage. So you can employ these strategies for different reasons than just utilizing Shocking Presence. It can take a lot of work to pull some of these off, and it just isn't worth it for this passive. This damage is equal to his level, so at level 2 it deals 2 true damage and at level 3 it deals 3 true damage. However, this is relatively worse damage if you're spending XP orbs for it. When other characters are at level 2 or 3, they can do a lot more damage or just a lot more in general, and usually with a lot less effort and risk. The cherry on top is that Shocking Presence can also free a frozen or sleeping enemy. So you can't even use these effects to set up additional damage for Shocking Presence. At the end of the day, Shocking Presence does more than nothing sometimes. The only thing shocking is what little presence it has. His other passive is the innate trait shared by crafters, Lock and Load. This gives him a bonus of 2 range on his next turn whenever he ends his current turn without using a skill. It's an effective way of adding a sniper option to the Zapper if you play your cards right. Now for his base attack. Jolt deals half the Zapper's attack stat, rounded up, plus 2 as magic damage to a single target. At level 1, this comes out to 4 magic damage, which ties with the Arcane Wizard. With a range of 4, it also ties with the Ranger's attacks at level 1. In other words, this base attack has the best of both worlds. 4 magic damage with 4 range is arguably the strongest base attack in the game at level 1. Physical attacks and melee attacks can deal more damage, but only Jolt has this combination of range and magic damage. It makes the Zapper one of the best level 1 companions if you want a powerful ranged attack, especially because 4 is among the best HP breakpoints. Every turn, you can take out one enemy after the next with 4 or less HP from a safe distance. On top of this, you have the option to use this innate trait to snipe enemies from an additional 2 range. It's a tremendous help to be able to take out dangerous enemies from a safe distance. Finally, it has an epic condition that inflicts burning for 1 turn on targets who are immobilized. All in all, Jolt and indirectly Lock and Load are the first pieces of evidence that support the possibility of the Zapper being a top tier companion. From level 1, he can fit into any team without being dead weight because he contributes the best ranged attack of any companion without needing any investment. His second level 1 skill is Lightning Ball. It deals his attack stat as physical damage, as well as 1 physical damage to all enemies and scenery adjacent to the main target, not including the main target itself. The main target does also get stunned for 1 turn. Since it deals worse damage than Jolt at level 1, this skill mostly serves the purpose of stunning a target. With this option in his arsenal, you can buy an extra turn to deal damage, making him useful against otherwise overwhelming enemies. Of course, as a full action on a 3-turn cooldown, it's not a skill that can be executed at leisure, but having the option there is great. It's just another element to his already great performance as a level 1 companion. The last thing to note about Lightning Ball is that it can be executed at melee range. Most ranged attacks don't follow this rule, so it's possible to stack this skill with Shocking Presence if the conditions are met. Not sure if you really want to though. What's more useful about this skill is that it deals splash damage. Enemies and environmental features adjacent to the main target will take 1 physical damage. This will always be 1 damage, as it doesn't have a formula, unless you count being equal to 1 as a formula. As low as this is, it's far more useful than Shocking Presence. This is because you can trigger explosive barrels, fire pots, etc. to stack way more damage onto enemies, and from a safe distance. Combine that with the base damage, it can actually deal some of the highest possible damage in a single turn. Then the stun is there for truly tanky main targets who somehow survived. It can also be used to clear out annoyances like tentacles, because unlike Shocking Presence, this AoE can actually hurt these things as well as bosses. There isn't much more to say about the Zapper at level 1. He's definitely among the best compared to other level 1 characters. One great way to use the Zapper is to bring him alongside party members who scale up tremendously well. Bruxa, Olok, the Orc Cleaver, and the Sylvan Elf are all examples of characters who get way stronger with each level. Bring the Zapper along and focus your XP on these characters so that they can reach their full potential. Meanwhile, the Zapper, who isn't at his full potential yet, is still able to keep up relatively better than most characters. But if you do want to level the Zapper up, here's what you can expect. The Zapper at level 2. The only stat changes to the Zapper are 6 HP and 4 attack now. This actually has no effect on Jolt, as he will still do 4 damage due to the formula, but it does bring Lightning Ball up to the same 4 damage. His basic attack is so good that it's still fine to deal 4 damage, but now he's relatively far more average compared to what other companions get at level 2. But are his skill choices any better? The first option is Chain Lightning. This is another full action that deals half his attack stat as magic damage to a single target, stuns it, then chains to up to 2 adjacent targets, dealing damage to them but without stunning them. The way the chains work is sometimes surprising. If you're familiar with the range's ricochet arrow, you know that a projectile that chains tends to follow a single path of enemies. It chains from the first target to a nearby second one, then it looks for a valid third target in range of the second target. Chain Lightning works differently though. For one, it can only chain within a range of 1 instead of 2. Also, it looks for a valid target from either the first or second target. What this means is that it could follow a straight path of enemies, chaining to one, then chaining to a third enemy who's adjacent to the second one. Or, it could chain in 2 different directions from the main target, both the second and third targets only being adjacent to the first rather than each other. In fact, when given the option to do either one of these, Chain Lightning seems to prefer going in 2 different directions. With this in mind, it's possible to pull off some pretty significant feats with this skill. Dealing half his attack stat per target means that it can deal 1.5 times his attack stat in total damage if it hits 3 targets. And since the damage rounds up for odd numbers, you can actually deal even more than that. At higher attack stats, the extra damage from rounding up becomes less relevant, but whether the factor of damage increased is higher or lower is irrelevant. As long as you're dealing more damage and ideally killing enemies, that is what matters. Like all AoE attacks, if there is scenery adjacent to the target, you can also use the skill to trigger those objects. You can also select environmentals as the skill's main target if an enemy is just out of range, so that they are hit by both the damage from chain lightning and whatever effect the environmental feature has. Once again, this is advice that applies to all attacks that can hit multiple targets. Lightning Ball and Chain Lightning are both great skills to activate explosive barrels while also dealing the attack's damage to the same target. Another thing these skills both have in common is stunning the primary target. Picking Chain Lightning means that the Zapper now has two different skills to inflict stun with. Both have a 3-turn cooldown, giving him a total of 2/3 uptime with his stun. Just stun an enemy with one of those two skills, then use the other skill on the next turn. There's only a 1-turn gap between having an enemy stunned completely. This provides your party with some very good stalling, and can easily be combined with a stun from another source to perma-stun an enemy. Both Lightning Ball and Chain Lightning are full actions, so you have to be in range to hit the enemy on the start of your turn. Luckily, the Zapper has long range, making it easier to position him so that you don't have to move him next turn. If you want a simple action for level 2, the Zapper also has Thunder Strike. This deals his attack damage as magic damage to a selected enemy. Then, a random target anywhere on the map will take 1/3 of the Zapper's attack damage as magic damage. Every enemy has an equal chance to be randomly targeted. And remember, lightning can strike twice. This random target can be any enemy, boss, scenery, or hazard, so it can easily get wasted on things like fire pots. With a 4-turn cooldown and no bonus effect on its target, it might seem like a worse alternative to Chain Lightning. But the fact that it deals his attack stat as damage to the main target means that it will outdamage his base attack. It's actually the highest single target damage that the Zapper has in his arsenal. So if you want to make him slightly better at dealing high damage in a single turn, this skill is his best choice. However, it should be clarified that while this does give him more burst damage, it only makes his weakness less weak. If you actually want high damage in a single turn, you will simply have to look for that in other companions. This has the downside of making the Zapper a worse choice in some boss fights, but even then, his damage can still make a difference in killing the boss, and can also be used to take out mobs, while stronger attacks can be directed at bosses and other tanky units. Like with any other party composition, distributing damage in a way that wastes the least amount and kills the most units is optimal. Overall, the Zapper is actually a mediocre level 2 companion. Sure, he can get 2/3 uptime with stun, but several other companions can get better stalling power at level 2, or have nearly equal stalling power at level 1. His damage doesn't go up very much. You need to pick Thunder Strike just to get slightly better single target damage, and getting 2 damage out of Shocking Presence instead of 1 is like getting Insert Joke Here. Really, the main reason I ever get the Zapper to level 2 is because I'm intending to get him to level 3. The Zapper at level 3. This beefy boy now has a whopping 8 HP. I guess this is to tank attacks and use Shocking Presence now, but he still has no armor. He does get 6 attack, as well as 5 range, and this is pretty crazy, because with 5 default range, he can snipe enemies safely with very little extra effort. But even if that's not enough, Lock and Load will bring his range to 7, and with movement speed, that gives him an effective range of 9. It's awesome. You can turn your brain off and just shoot enemies from a safe distance. Jolt should now deal 5 magic damage, while Lightning Ball deals 6 physical, plus the 1 area physical damage. And getting to stun an enemy from 5 hexes away really helps mitigate the fact that Chain Lightning and Lightning Ball are full actions. And the extra attack damage helps make Thunder Strike all the better as well. These stat changes are good. His abilities, however, are superb. The first skill he can pick is Raise Coil. I'm just going to call it Tesla Coil because that's what it summons. The Zapper spawns a Tesla Coil on a selected free hex. This Tesla Coil does not move. Its turn will always be right after the Zapper's, where it can only do one thing, shoot a blast of lightning for 2 to 3 magic damage. It is not affected by any stat buffs to the Zapper, so this is its static damage. It used to have 3 range, but now has 4. This includes targets adjacent to the coil. The attack will be randomly selected to hit any unit in its range, except for allies. This means that scenery and hazards are valid targets. It's best to not place it in range of these hazards, as it's better to trigger them using the Zapper's AoE skills instead. What's truly unique about the Tesla Coil though is that it has infinite duration. This is important because all summons act as an investment of sorts. Rather than dealing 5 magic damage with Jolt, the Tesla Coil only contributes 2 to 3, and it is randomly chosen. The only way to benefit from spawning a Tesla Coil is if it gets to do more than just this one attack. Since it lasts for longer than one turn, it should be able to attack again, which results in another 2 to 3 damage, making up for the damage lost by not using Jolt. It also has 2 HP, so it can take an attack from an enemy that might not have been finished off by the Zapper's other moves. However, this Tesla Coil will die really easily. And with a 3-turn cooldown, it isn't that viable to spawn that many of these in a single combat encounter. But if you do find a way, it is possible to spawn an infinite amount of these and break the game. Overall, this ability can be a bit niche. Not only do you need to find a way to make random targeting useful, but you also need to make sure that the random targeting is useful on at least one future turn for the damage to be optimal. The most common way to make it useful is when the enemy doesn't need more than 2 damage to be taken care of, so the investment can be made without any tangible loss. Then you have an extra damage source on the field, even if it targets randomly, takes up a hex that it can't move from, and dies in one hit almost every time. Treating it like a ranged companion by keeping it safe turns it essentially into a turret, which is really cool, but it still doesn't shape up to the raw power of the Zapper's other level 3 skill. Magnetic Trap is the best skill in this game. That is my opinion, and here's why. To begin, the Zapper throws a trap on a selected hex in range, that being up to 5 hexes away since he's at level 3. Anything within 2 hexes of the trap will be pulled in closer to the trap and rooted. What this means is that enemies who are exactly 2 hexes away will be pulled in such that they are now 1 hex away from the trap. Enemies who are already 1 hex away will not be moved. However, all enemies will be rooted. This also triggers environmental hazards, but it won't affect things like tentacles. It will move the environmental hazards first and then trigger them, allowing you to pull them into enemies so that they can then be exploded on. The rooted effect lasts for 2 turns. Meanwhile, the skill itself has a 3-turn cooldown and is a full action. What makes this ability so good is that Rooted is like a slightly less helpful version of Stun. It prevents enemies from moving, but they can use their skills if a valid target is in range, which isn't really a problem with the Zapper's long range. This means that ranged and support enemies suffer less from Rooted compared to melee enemies. But still, as long as you stay out of range, these enemies will not be able to pose a threat to your party. Each Rooted enemy therefore gets 2 turns taken away from them, giving you the breathing room to focus on other things. With the Zapper having 5 range and this AoE reaching 2 hexes away, it can capture several enemies on the very first round of most any combat encounter. This isn't to say that it's best to use it immediately every time. The fact that it can be used effectively if used instantly is just a consequence of the skill being so good. Most AoE skills cover a 1 hex AoE or have a 1 hex radius, but Magnetic Trap has a 2 hex radius, making it much stronger. And with 2/3 uptime, this skill is the closest thing to a win button in the game. 2 whole turns to practically ignore several enemies on the map is unlike anything else in the game. Even Frostlance isn't this easy to use to immobilize enemies. Some skills in the game are better in other ways, but overall, I find this the most helpful. It doesn't do much against bosses who are immune to Rooted, but if they can have enemies in the boss fight, it can still be helpful to use it on them so that you can focus on the boss. So besides being a useful level 1 companion, another valid strategy for the Zapper is to rush to level 3. That way, you can get the Magnetic Trap early on, trivializing every combat encounter up to the boss. This is important because combat encounters generally seem to give more XP than any other type of encounter on the map, so you can get more XP for the party overall if you pursue combat. The Zapper has so many ways to apply Immobilized. It makes for a lot of satisfying synergies with companions who have epic effects on immobilized enemies. These immobilizations also make him a great support character, buying breathing room for melee and ranged units alike. He doesn't absorb stat buffs very well, so those are better saved for other characters. The one buff he really gets a lot of mileage out of is Invigoration, since he has so many full actions. But this abundance of full actions also makes Exhaustion less detrimental, since he moves less often before using a skill compared to other characters. His biggest downsides are that he doesn't scale that well with mid-game, since the XP used to get him to level 2 doesn't feel like it's spent that effectively. But since he starts from such a strong point at level 1, it really isn't too bad at the end of the day. Other than shocking presence, all of his skills can be helpful in some way. I do think Magnetic Trap outclasses Ray's Coil pretty hard, but the Tesla Coils are fun and not really a bad choice if you can use them properly. So, is he one of the best companions in the game? Yes and no. He has specific strengths that are easy to utilize, and when they are utilized correctly, he is incredible. But when his strengths aren't at the forefront, such as when facing bosses or when he's still only on his way to level 3, he falls a bit short. So plan ahead and craft a solution to use the Zapper to his utmost potential.